it's always a preview of what's to come in the next season. Next year, we don't anticipate any crazy changes to this bike because this bike is basically the same as the 2023 KTM 450. As everybody knows, that bike was all new last year, all new chassis, all new engine. But because it's a factory edition model, it does have some aftermarket upgrades like the X-Jig triple clamps. It's got the Akrapovic muffler on there, not the header, but the muffler, and some other trick goodies. So in this video, we're going to be diving into the pros and cons of this bike, sharing the differences about it compared to the stock bike and what we've learned about the KTM 450 so far. So looking back at the history of factory edition bikes, we have to say a big thank you to Roger DeCoster. When Roger left Suzuki for KTM, he told Ryan Dungey to stay at Team Suzuki for 1 extra year because in 2011, KTM did not have a fuel-injected 450 SXF motocross bike. They only had a fuel-injected 450 XCF enduro bike. For 2012, Roger convinced Austria to revise the enduro engine, add a 5-speed transmission, and put the all-new 450 SXF engine in an improved motocross chassis, all in time for the start of the 2012 Supercross season. It sounds simple enough, but in order to race a brand new fuel-injected 450 in the 2012 AMA Supercross series, the bike had to meet the AMA homologation rules, which meant that KTM had to build 400 production line versions before it could legally be raced. Ryan Dungey's 2012 race bike was the precursor to the fuel-injected 2013 KTM 450 SXF. Since consumers could buy the Ryan Dungey replica 6 months before the 2013 bike was in the production showrooms, it was a smash hit and sales success, even though it was only limited to 400 units. The success caused KTM to continue to produce factory editions for the last 11 years. Originally, we thought maybe they would just do one to get Dungey on that first model for his first year with KTM, but KTM, it was such a success that they kept going on it for years to come. The problem, of course, is that KTM, they don't make drastic R&D changes every year. There are some years where there's nothing factory about the factory editions except for bolt-on aftermarket parts, the orange frame color, and special graphics. And that is true of the 2023 and a half KTM 450 factory edition, as we don't see any changes coming down the line for this bike in 2024, so it's just aftermarket parts. So let's get into the differences between this bike, differentiating it from the stock 2023 KTM 450. Well, first off, the stock bike comes with a black frame. This factory edition comes with the beautiful orange frame that definitely pops and makes this bike look really good. It's got the factory racing seat cover, gripper seat with ribs on it. Personally, that's a huge plus for me. I love gripper seats. It's also got the Power Parts factory wheels with orange nipples and orange hubs. It's also got the Akrapovic slip-on muffler, the semi-floating front brake rotor, the Power Parts factory front brake disc guard, the Power Parts factory skid plate, Power Parts Racing adjustable offset triple clamps. These are adjustable between the stock 22mm and the even closer in offset 20mm triple clamps, so that's pretty interesting. It's also got the factory Power Parts hole shot device. It comes with a Hinson clutch cover, the orange anodized rear sprocket, a gold DID chain, and of course the Red Bull KTM graphics. So all of these extras make the KTM Factory Edition 450 cost $12,099, which is $1,200 more than the stock 2023 model. So how does the KTM 450 SXF Factory Edition bike run on the track? Well, if you've ridden a 2023 KTM 450, then you know exactly how this bike feels because it has the exact same engine and the exact same mapping. The only difference is the quieter Akrapovic muffler, which really doesn't make a huge power gain on this bike because it's just the muffler. MXA, we've always criticized the pre-2023 KTM 450s for being down on power as they work their way towards the impressive mid and top spread. Well, with this new engine, the 2023 bike accelerates much harder out of corners and it keeps on pulling through the top end. The best part about the KTM 450 power is that it is still smooth. It's like one long locomotive style of power that builds at a progressive rate from 5,000 to 4,900 RPM. We've been critical of KTM in the past for their stock and aggressive maps being too close together, not offering a distinct difference between 1 and 2. Well, for 2023, the maps are a huge difference. Map 1, the white map, is mellow. It's the stock map, and map 2 is the green map, and it is much more aggressive. Because the bike is so fast, most of our testers stick with map 1 for racing, but it is nice to have the option to add more power with the click of a button. The main difference between KTM and Husqvarna FC450 Rockstar Edition power-wise is that the Husky comes with an FMF muffler instead of the Akrapovic. The Husky, it also has a closed-off airbox. You can see on the new generation KTMs that it's wide open underneath the seat, where the Husky is completely closed off. That makes a lot more air and going into the airbox, which creates a more snappy and responsive power down low, but it doesn't affect peak horsepower too much, as both of these bikes hit about the same horsepower on the dyno. On the dyno, the KTM450SXF Factory Edition hits 59.9 horsepower, basically 60 horsepower, which is wicked fast for a stock bike. This bike also comes with traction control and quick shifting, but we really don't use either of them too often on this bike. As for suspension, there are some changes to increase comfort and adjustability on the forks and shock for the 2023.5 KTM450SXF Factory Edition. This is really the only structural change between the stock bike and the Factory Edition model, and basically what it is that the stock settings, they're not going to feel any different than the last year's bike or than the current 2023 stock bike, but WP's goal was to make the suspension less finicky when compared to the 2023 models. On the forks, WP says they made minor refinements to the compression shim stack to make the mid-valving damping feel more fluid and more comfortable, but they didn't touch anything on the rebound side of the forks damping, nor are there any alterations to the suggested air pressure or clicker settings. These WP exact air forks should feel very similar to your 2023 bike, only the changes they made were to make the clickers less finicky so that one click doesn't make such a big difference on this bike. As for the shock, the WP technicians said that with the help of the KTM's R&D crew from America, they developed a new high-speed compression damping setting because they felt the 23 bike was too big of a gap per adjustment. Same song and dance on the forks, same song and dance on the shock. The goal was to get the high-speed compression dial to be a little smaller adjustments per dial movement. How much smaller? Well, each incremental change was reduced by 50% on this bike. So you guys might remember that the new KTM and the new Austrian bikes have adjustable by hand clickers. You don't need a flathead screwdriver or a T-handle to adjust your high speed or your compression. You can adjust them by hand. So basically this gives the rider the ability to fine-tune the compression changes on the track. You can just make a few clicker adjustments down there. Last year's shock and last year's fork, WP thought that it was too easy to go out of range with the forks and shock on adjustment. They thought that if you clicked 2 or 3 times, it made too big of a difference. They wanted to refine the changes, make it a little bit smaller so it's more rider friendly and less likely to get into some wild settings. So the high-speed compression damping, it's controlled by a spring pressing on the shim stack, and WP didn't change the adjuster or the spring, but instead they went from 15 shims to 23 shims, and that's just another way that they're making a wider and more relaxed range of adjustment on the shock and forks. Talking about the handling of the 2023 KTM450SXF Factory Edition, the big difference for the new generation bike is that it has an ultra strong forged steel brackets on top of the frame's backbone and on the bottom of the frame's down tube. Basically the front of this frame has a lot more forged units on it. It's a lot stronger and a lot stiffer as a result. So combining those extra forged pieces with the new frame geometry for the 2023 chassis, this frame is durable and stronger, but it also requires a lot more break-in time. We recommend at least 10 hours of break-in time on your KTM 450SXF Factory Edition. Before that, the bike's gonna feel stiff, rigid, and harsh. Definitely make sure to get at least 10 hours before you start racing this thing, because that's when it's gonna start to feel comfortable, is after the 10-hour mark. But apart from the break-in issues, we actually really like the way that this model feels in motion. Yes, it is heavier, especially on the front wheel, but depending on the track conditions, this isn't a deal breaker for us. By rotating the engine 2 degrees backwards, KTM lowered the countershaft sprocket by 3 mil in the frame's cradle, and this actually lessens how much the bike squats under acceleration and reduces chain torque. You can feel the difference with the rear end riding taller on the track, and you can feel an improvement in rear wheel traction on this bike as well. Talking about the new bodywork on this new generation KTM 450SXF, it is ergonomically shaped to work with the human body well. The width of the shrouds, the tank, and the side panels makes it much easier to grip the bike with your knees, and the airbox is larger as well, making it easier to access this bike to get your air filter in and out. Also, it does come with the optional ventilated airbox cover, as KTM has given riders for the last 2 years as well. The foot pegs look bigger and they look like they stick out farther on this bike, but they're actually mounted further inboard on the frame to make sure that your boots don't get hung up on the frame or on the foot peg mount. A lot of riders complained, and I do myself, riding the 23 Yamaha YZ450F, that we stand on the foot peg mount a lot. You won't have the issue on this KTM450. As for complaints about this bike, we do have a complaint about the start-stop button. That's a big one. We don't like that the electric start and the kill button are on the same switch. First, the buttons, they're too low profile and kind of hard to activate with gloves on your finger. Second, we don't like that they're both on the right side of the bike. Every time we stop and we want to turn our KTM off, we always reach on the left side looking for the kill switch, but it's not there. It's right next to the start button on the right-hand side. That's pretty weird. We also need to be careful whenever we're washing this bike, because it can, if you get water in this start-stop switch, it can cause your bike to have electrical problems, and we definitely don't want that. So be careful spraying the pressure washer right there. We also hate that the spokes still come loose on this bike. Even though these are the factory edition wheels, the factory power parts wheels that you can order through KTM, they still come loose on the spokes. We also don't like that this bike gained 5 pounds over the previous generation bike, but we can't complain too much because it's still lighter than the rest of the Japanese models. We also don't like the taller seat height, and because of the new countershaft sprocket position, the chain eats through the swing arm buffer pad, the chain slider, much more quickly than it has before. So that's a couple things you need to keep your eye on. Overall, we know this bike well and we do appreciate a lot about it, but it's still not a perfect model. We hope